Hello, George.
Hey.
Hey, I've done this podcast for about a year, or just over a year now, and you're the first returner. So it's good to have you back.
Yes. Brilliant. All right. Thank you. That is a compliment. I'll take it.
Yeah, definitely a compliment. It's really good to have you back. There's quite a lot that's happened since we last spoke as well regarding men's issues.
Hmm.
Um, and I want to start off by talking about men's mental health because obviously there's been, even when we first had the first interview, there was a lot of conversation about it. But now this seems to have ramped up a bit of pace with like what happened with Jeff Norcott. He had a gig last week, well, this week actually, a few days ago, and there's been more talking about it. How do you think the conversation around men's mental health has developed over the last year or so? Is it taken more seriously, or is it seen as a joke, or what's your
I,
thoughts on that?
I, I think it's been a while since it's been seen as a joke. I think we've all accepted that men's mental health is a serious issue right now.
Mhm.
I feel like we've gone down a level now, thankfully, and we're talking about things a bit more defined, like male loneliness, for example, is becoming something that's increasingly of concern. And it is being taken a bit more seriously by politicians and by the mass media. It's still being ridiculed for sure, unfortunately, and that's always going to happen. But I think, yeah, because obviously I talk a lot about the very virtuous, kind of shallow understanding of men's mental health that sort of pleads with men to talk and cry, but then doesn't really talk itself about the things that men are talking about. But now we are going deeper. So we are talking a little bit more about male victims of abuse. We are talking a little bit more about child custody, relationship breakdown, the impacts that joblessness and debt has on men's mental health, and male suicide especially. That's not to say the journey's over. It's far from it. This is still the very beginning, but we're moving in the right direction. And whether or not we're moving fast enough, I don't think so. No, I don't think we can ever move fast enough, but we are moving in the right direction.
So one of the aspects in regards to men's mental health that could help is their own spaces. Um, and there was an interview you did, I think it was on a Modern Wisdom podcast, where you talked
Mm.
about Robert Dunbar and this study he did regarding guy spaces. Can you just explain what that study was and what the
The-
results were?
I can talk about that, but the real message. Okay, so basically, the study was that Robin Dunbar, who's an extremely famous scientist, he developed the idea of the Dunbar's number. He's come up with some research that says men need to spend 2 nights a week with other men, their friends, for the benefit of their mental and physical health. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of male loneliness. Male
Mhm.
loneliness is probably the biggest associated factor of male suicide that we know of. I have a friend of mine, Susie Bennett, who has put together an agenda on male suicide research. And she's basically asked dozens of international experts and hundreds of lived experience experts all over the world, what do you want to be researched within male suicide? And the biggest one, 98% of all people agreed male loneliness is the priority right now. So male loneliness and male suicide are inextricably linked. And Robin Dunbar's talking about is that we need to spend more time together physically with our friends, and especially men with other men. That's a wonderful thing. That is, I don't know why anyone could disagree with that, but there always
Mhm.
is a disagreement, and there is always pushback about the idea of men's spaces. The idea of men hanging out with other men uh, is to so many people totally unpalatable, just grotesque, and we just do not like it. And I remember just looking at so many posts about that study. It would just say men need to spend 2 nights a week with each other for their mental health, and below it, it was just the same outrage, the same narcissism, and just anger and hostility towards just the concept of men, A, having any sort of mental health problem, B, suffering from male loneliness, and C, the solution being more time. And it was just like, men don't need more time with men. Men should be at home looking after children. Men should be at home with their wives, or women need 7 nights a week with their friends. And
Yeah.
I understand the study itself was not particularly great. But that wasn't the issue I'm looking at. The issue I'm looking at is people's response to the findings and just the hostility and outrage and disdain for any space for men, especially men hanging out with other men. And that's the real message that I don't want to be lost. That it's not the study that's important; it's people's reaction that is important, and that's something we need to confront because we can't solve male suicide unless we can confront male loneliness, and we can't confront male loneliness until we stand up to the bullies that are so vehemently against the idea of men hanging out with other men. And that's what I learned from that study.
Okay. So two things there. In regards to the mental health,
Mm,
you say it's not seen as a joke, but I remember in the time that we had the last interview, Jeff Norcott went on the BBC and he started talking about male suicide and that's a serious problem. And there's two women there who laughed at it. And there
yeah.
seems to be that culture. Is that something that's dying down now? Is that something that's seen as reprehensible? Is that still seen as a joke? Because there seems to be still pockets of that around.
I'm talking about the general consensus towards men's mental health being
Okay.
a bit more understanding, compassionate. It's by I do not want to suggest we are out of the woods, we're certainly not,
Mm.
but we are moving the right way. There are still certainly people that do think it's a joke, and that will always be true. The solution is just to ignore them, leave them behind. Uh, but yeah, I think we are doing more to understand what causes men's mental health and the like harmful concepts like toxic masculinity, which is continually pointed at as some sort of bogeyman behind men's mental health and male suicide. That is finally falling out of favor. People are fine. I've seen so many people's like articles and tweets and like very famous sort of psychologists and journalists and politicians saying toxic masculinity is just toxic terminology. And they're like, they're saying like it took me years and years to realize that, and now I finally have, and I'm like, thank God. It shouldn't have taken that long, but you got there in the end. And I'm seeing it less and less, and I'm seeing more and more rejection of it, and I'm grateful. So we're moving beyond this idea that um, men's mental health problems are caused by some sort of internal problem or some sort of personal failing on behalf of the men. And we are slowly opening our eyes to the idea that men's mental health is impacted by their environment and structural issues, economic issues, political issues, just like women. And I think we're widening our perspective a little tiny bit, not a huge amount, but more so than it was, a year ago, whenever we last spoke. So yeah,
I think an example of that was at the time of recording this, the previous week, they had that documentary with Danny Dyer.
yeah,
And when we think of him, actually, it was two parts. And I thought the first part in particular was very good.
mm,
And you see the responses to that people saying, oh gosh, okay, this is. There's one article I read saying, oh, why there's got men's spaces everywhere, like a typical response.
yeah, the Guardian probably.
But there seems a bit, well, he was a Guardian, yeah.
There we go.
But he was, but he
Easy.
was there seems to be a big turning point now with that. People saying, "Oh gosh, we didn't realise that this was getting really bad." So I agree with you that there seems to be certainly a turning point. Um,
Well,
how I'm just hoping, fingers crossed that it speeds up a bit now and like we finally start talking about it in a serious manner, not just toxic masculinity or any of these buzzwords that have been so damaging for the last few.
mm. Well, the journalist who wrote that Guardian review of the amazing Danny Dyer TV show, she also reviewed Men's Sheds. So obviously, Men's Sheds is another thing about men's spaces, which has quite literally saved the lives of hundreds of men, potentially
Mm.
hundreds of men, and saved families, saved relationships, saved people being heartbroken, and obviously saved lives. And when that happened in 2010, she was like hated it. She was like, women are the ones that need sheds, not men. The same shit you hear from the Robin Dunbar study. And she's got egg on her face on that because Men's Sheds is an amazing organization. And now she's going to have more egg on her face. She's not learned a lesson. She's still going. She's not satisfied for embarrassing herself one time. She has to come back for seconds. And she wrote a scathing 2-star review for that TV show. And it was brilliant. It was so brave.
Yeah,
And like it was just Danny Dyer was so earnest and honest. And like just seeing his face, like it was just I've seen that face so many times, that shocked face, distraught, helpless face, like just can't believe what he's seeing. Like, how did I not know this? And I'm like, it's so nice to see it on his face as well. It was I liked the second part more than the first. I thought the first was a bit odd when they went and spoke to that pickup artist idiot, the misogynistic guy, and I was just like, he is such a poor reference point
yeah,
for
yeah,
this. And then they spoke to those schoolboys about Andrew Tate and about the dangers of Andrew Tate brainwashing our boys in the UK. And I don't know what you felt, but I felt those boys gave such beautiful, balanced, grown-up answers. Again, very earnest. And I was just like, how could you disagree with what they're saying? They were just like giving such thoughtful responses. And again, the teacher was there, like, yeah, but Andrew Tate is bad. And they were like, yeah, well. And I feel like they really tried to frame that interview in a way, like a sinister way. And the boys didn't give them what they wanted because they gave like great
Mm.
answers, in my opinion. But the remainder of that episode and the second episode was like really interesting, very brave of them to talk about male victims of abuse and how they've been let down by the domestic violence industry and how little refuge there is for them. So I very much enjoyed that bit, and especially family courts and the family court system and CPS and all that. So I enjoyed it, and the review the feedback I saw the most was like it's not long enough. And I was like, it certainly isn't. You need like a 12-part series to capture these things. There's so much to say. It's like what people say about my account. It's like you're talking all the time about different issues every single day. And I'm like, there's a lot to get through. There is a lot to get through. And yeah, if that's the only negative you can get, that there isn't enough time in the day to talk about these things, that is an interesting bit of feedback in its own right.
I I mean, I'm going to talk about some of the topics in that documentary later.
Mm,
But I spoke to a friend of mine recently about men's issues, and I said, this sounds really silly, but I almost compared it to Brexit and Trump in 2016, in the sense that when those results came out, people were shocked. And the reason people were shocked is because they didn't speak, they were refusing to speak to people who
mm,
voted for those, like whether it's to leave the European Union or to vote for Trump. And
mm.
so they didn't speak, they stayed in their own bubble and called them all the names under the sun. And in a way, men's issues have been like that in the sense
Yeah,
of, well, maybe you do disagree, but I don't think people talk to boys enough and men enough.
no.
It's this thing of, oh, well, this is what's happened and it's, oh, well, we'll just pass it off or we'll just make up our own assumption. Do you agree with that at all?
Yeah, I definitely agree that we almost only ever talk about boys and men, and we never talk to them. We literally tell them what to say, what they can't say, what to think, what's causing their issues. We tell them what causes male suicide, what causes men to take their own life, even though the families of those men often don't know themselves. We seem to know everything about men, and we never actually ask them about it themselves. And yeah, we live in a bubble. I was in the Brexit bubble. I voted Remain. I went on all the marches for a second vote. And it was embarrassing. I genuinely was blown. I watched the results came out live. I stayed up all night watching those, and my face, I was just like, this is Gibraltar was first, I remember, and it was like
Yeah.
98% Remain, and I was like, done and done. And then from then it was just like, and same. I mean, obviously I didn't get a vote in the US presidential election, but I was equally anti-Trump and equally blown away when he won. And it shows that we are living in bubbles and we are constantly just patting ourselves on the back. We think we know everything. We are all the hero of our own story
Mm.
until you're not, until you open your eyes. And the fact is, like, just because you're the loudest doesn't mean you're the majority. And often people like me are shouted down or talked over by people who are just wrong, but louder than me. And those people that are loud, they mistake that for being the majority, and they think that other people are supportive of them when they're not. I mean, I have 80% of my following are afraid to even share the content I make. So they'll see a piece of content, they enjoy it, they think it's useful, and they want to share it, but they won't. So that shows you that my following, the impact is actually only 20% of what it should be. And I'm thinking that's just like that's sort of like a microcosm of what you're talking about. Is that we don't realize that there is a lot more support for these issues, but there are just lots and lots of people that are just afraid, and understandably so, of talking about them. And that's changing as well. And more we talk about it, and the more we show these issues as not only something to be avoided, but something to be embraced and something that's important, nothing to be ashamed of, the more we set an example, the more people that will follow. So I'm looking forward to episode 3 of this podcast, and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and many more to come over the years.
Yeah, indeed. And you mentioned there about the boys in the documentary who talk about Andrew Tate.
Yeah,
And I think I discussed this with you in the last interview we did, but I've always said that one of the problems I have with people who hate Andrew Tate isn't so much they hate what he stands for, but that they do not come up with any alternatives.
no.
They seem to leave a vacuum, and that even after we last spoke, that still seems to be the case, where they'll just leave a vacuum and say, "Well, men should do this and men should do that." Do you think A, why don't they come up with any alternatives? And I'm just wondering as well, like, yeah, basically, why don't they come up with any alternatives to Andrew Tate? Because there are probably plenty out there, but they're just not showcasing them.
Uh, I think it's easier to set a fire than it is to put it out. and they are great at setting fires. They're great at pointing a finger and shouting down any suggestion, any sort of solution. But then when it comes, like you said, like you're right, when it comes to them presenting their own solution, they've got nothing. And it's almost certain that Labour Party are going to win the election this year, and they will be in power at the end of this year. And they've already come out and said that they have a plan to do like an anti-Andrew Tate, like deprogramming of boys in UK schools. And I just have a feeling it's going to be dreadful. It's just going to be round two. It's just going to be the same point, finger in the face of boys. You're the problem. You're toxic. Da 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 da. Why couldn't you be more like girls? And they're just going to be like same blank faces, and they're just going to go away and understandably look for a role model that actually listens to them, speaks to them, and that person's going to be Andrew Tate or worse, and we'll be back again, like round and round we go. And the fact is, like society and especially the left have failed to provide men and boys with an adequate role model, I think, especially role models that are traditionally masculine, which is just abhorrent these days, apparently. And like I said, it's easier to set a fire than it is to put one out, and they don't have any solutions aside from shaming boys and blaming them, and like going round and retraining boys on how to be a functional member of society, which is just essentially what Andrew Tate does. You're just brainwashing them, basically.
Mhm, mhm. It's interesting. I mean, you talk about shock as well, and what we talked about before with regards to people not talking to other people in their bubbles. What
Mm.
was your reaction to when I think a government minister talked about conscription and the response from men in relation to that? Because there seemed to be a lot of young boys saying, we ain't dealing with this. And then people seem to be in very much shock. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah, I think there's a huge lack of national pride, especially in the young, and probably more so within young men. And I don't understand when the young have been trodden on, deprived of any sort of like help from the government, who've just been shat on for our entire adult lives. I don't consider myself one. I'm very lucky to not be in that cohort, but there's a huge amount of disaffected young men and women who have been left behind. They can't buy a house, they won't get a pension, they can barely afford to pay rent. Rent's going up, the government don't care. They've all the promises about free education have been broken, and they're in debt, and they won't pay that off either. And they're being screwed over by the government. And now the government is floating the idea of that same person risking their life to protect the nation. And I'm like, why the hell would anyone do that? Least of all the young. And I certainly wouldn't do it. And the idea of conscription is not, I don't think it's as distant of a idea as people like to pretend it is. Everyone's like, well, we haven't conscripted anyone in 50 years since Vietnam. And I'm like, you not looking at the news, look at Russia, look at Israel, and it is happening, and we're talking about it now. It's not a outlandish thing. And it would be interesting if there were if they did try to do a military draft in the UK. I just think there'd be no one would do it, and why would they? Meanwhile, you have people like Boris Johnson saying he would enlist, and then him posing for like Daily Mail like photo shoots, pretending for hand grenades and firing rocket launchers, and he's like, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." He was, and I'm like, "You are probably the most gutless man in this whole country, Boris, and you
Mhm.
should go and fight. You go first, and we'll be right behind you, mate." And I guess it shows a lot about how disaffected young people are and how totally out of touch the politicians are. And yeah, well, I guess we'll see what happens next.
Just quickly, and it's before the time I do is go back to the whole male spaces. I don't know if you remember did you see the story about the Garrick Club and how basically they're trying to get, I think it was women in that club, if you recall. I don't know if you saw that. The Garrick Club
No.
is like this club in London where I think it's
Oh, the
like,
Garrick. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I thought you were saying Gary. I was like, Gary Club. Garrick.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Garrick.
Garrick. So how what was your reaction to that? Because that seemed to be okay, there were high profile like judges and lawyers and from high professions, but
Mm.
seemed to be a backlash again because it was strictly men and it seemed to be reported as nefarious that it all got together, even though chances are they aren't.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see that as like the physical manifestation of the actual patriarchy, like men, men's club, all extremely wealthy, privileged, powerful men, sort of sliding the chips of society around and all planning on how we're going to oppress women more and more and more. I don't know if Garrick's a great example of what I'm talking about because the Garrick is sort of just like a bunch of privileged men
Yeah.
swilling wine, martinis, and just not really giving like smoking cigars and stuff. What I'm interested in is like men's spaces for normal men, working class men especially, to
Mhm.
rebuild a sense of male camaraderie and companionship, and to actually address the idea of male loneliness. The issues of those in the Garrick are not particularly of concern to me. I couldn't care less, but it certainly brings up an interesting double standard of the fact that there are women's clubs like the Garrick that men are not allowed in, and I don't think they should be allowed in. But when it comes to a male space, and the Garrick is one of the very few left in the country, it's again, it's outrageous apparently, but it's not. And it's not. I don't. Obviously, I don't go, and I don't really care much about it. But I'd rather talk more broadly about the wider disdain for men's spaces, which is certainly a much bigger issue.
There's a episode I actually recorded it yesterday, but it'll go out in probably next week.
Hmm.
And it was I was interviewing a guy who's written a pamphlet to do with the closure of pubs and how pubs were seen as not just places where
Hmm.
you drink alcohol, but places where you meet as well.
Hmm.
One of the questions I asked him, I'm going to ask you, do you think that the industrialization in regards to men meeting up and men like almost being men has contributed to a lot of the decline of men's mental health? Because you could go to certain places, like say if pubs closed, people will go to the pub or people meet each other in like down the mines, and okay, you're working but you're talking around other men. But there seems to be less places than that. I'm not just talking about the closure of spaces, I just mean in general, be it the workplace, be it activities wherever. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, and also like, a lot of people working from home now,
Yeah.
and like they're not going into like you're not going to work, you're not going to an office, you're not hanging out at lunch, you're not going to drinks after you finish, knocked off for the day, and obviously that's sort of shattered a little bit of the social fabric of society. Add to that the closure of pubs, add to that the closure of youth clubs, especially for young boys, and especially inner city black boys, and I feel like we're very divided. Um, And I think a lot of that is down to the pressure to constantly work. I think people are just exhausted. I think people are just haven't got the time, quite literally, to go and hang out at the pub or the money, because everyone like the cost of living crisis and inflation and all the other stuff is putting huge amount of financial pressure on the normal working person, and they just can't. Like if you look at places like South Korea, which is sort of like 5 years down the road from us,
Hmm.
like they're like I think the government are trying to pressure people to work 6 days a week. And what's also happening in South Korea is like the birth rate is tumbling. Men and women are divided more than ever. It's absolutely terrifying. And no one's having children. No one's getting married. No one's like it's almost like a hypercharged version of what you said's happening here. And yeah, pubs and youth clubs, I think would be an amazing. If I was the prime minister, I would put so much money into bringing, especially youth clubs, especially in London. And I feel like we'd all benefit. Sort of the secondary benefits of that would be incredible.
We've spoken about one documentary, Danny Dyer. I'm going to speak about another one, and this was on Channel 5 a few weeks ago regarding domestic violence. And
Mm.
first of all, did you get a chance to see it? And secondly, how would you assess how we deal with domestic violence with regards to men, just in general?
That's the documentary with the man who was being abused by his wife, and
Yes.
it was secretly filmed on the nanny cam.
Yeah, yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, terrifying. Like that was so powerful. So that was basically like a nanny cam, like a hidden camera and like a teddy bear that's there to film a nanny just to keep an eye on her. But it also accidentally captured a woman tormenting and abusing in the most horrific way you could possibly imagine her husband for 20 years. And I think that was just, you can't ignore that. You can't ignore the footage. And it really blew away this concept of women can't actually harm a man. Everyone's like, what could a woman do to hurt a man? And I'm like, watch that documentary. And it's not, abuse doesn't happen on like a one night occasion. That's it. It happens over years. It's a pattern of abuse. That's what makes abuse abuse. It's a pattern of behavior.
Mhm.
And you just really watch that man's life get absolutely destroyed and you just see him. It's honestly breaks my heart to even think about it now. But it's like him like curled up in a ball and her yelling at him, shouting at him, throwing things at him, and he's just there taking it. He can't lash out, and that's everyone talks about power dynamics. The man has the power and she doesn't, and it's like there is truth to that, but there was a power dynamic going on in that documentary where she was hitting him, hitting with bottles, hitting like this, and if he'd responded with the same amount of force, like hit her back, which would be understandable, she could call the police and he'd be like totally fucked. And she could take everything from him. Like one call to domestic violence services or the police, he'd be taken away and arrested. That's a power dynamic too. And you really see a new type of power dynamic within that Channel 5 documentary that is not talked about enough. And that is the power dynamic in which women have power over men. And anyone that thinks that a woman cannot abuse a man, go and watch a documentary because it's just unbelievable. It's so powerful and devastating.
Yeah, it was really hit home, and as I say, with a lot of these issues, it's really starting to hit home, like with other people as well. We're really starting to
Mm,
break that barrier, which I think is a good
mm.
thing. In regards to going back to domestic violence, how close are we to actually having more men's shelters? Because again, in the Danny Dyer documentary, I think they reported from one in the first part about a male shelter, but that seems to be one of a few in the country. So, is any progress being made in terms of developing shelters specifically for men?
Yeah, I mean progress, but nowhere near enough. Like progress going from 1% abuse shelters to 2% or maybe 3%, that's the progress we're looking at. Like again, it's the first step, but it's still progress and it's nowhere near what it should be. Like you got to remember at least 30% of abuse victims are men, and they have about 1%, perhaps now 2%, maybe even 3% of abuse shelter is for them, but it's still nowhere near adequate. And it's interesting you brought that up because tomorrow, 26th of April, is the anniversary of the suicide of Earl Silverman. And he set up a refuge for men in Canada. Because often people say, why don't men set up their own refuges? And that's exactly what he did. Earl Silverman was a male victim of abuse. He sought help, found none, and he was actually treated as a abuser himself by the police. So he did that. He set up his own refuge. He turned his house into a refuge for men, got zero funding from the Canadian government, not a single cent, funded himself and through donations of kind strangers. And for years took men in, years and years and years. He lost everything. He lost his house, he lost his shelter, and he lost his life because he killed himself because he had nothing. And that was 11 years ago tomorrow. And whenever people ask me, why don't men set up their own shelters? I'm like, just go and read about Earl Silverman. And he is not on his own. Like, there are so many like him, like Erin Pitsey, similar. She's like the English female equivalent of Earl Silverman. She set up the first refuge in the world for women,
Mhm.
and wrote the first book on domestic violence, and set up the biggest domestic violence charity on the planet, Refuge UK. And she immediately realized that half of the women, at least half of the women coming to her were abusive. So she was like, well, obviously I need a separate refuge for men. She tried to do that. Same, death threats, bomb threats, police escort, bomb squad going for a male, left the country eventually. And again, that's another answer to why don't you set up your own refuge? It's because we don't want to be treated, we don't want to be picketed and harassed and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
threatened. And obviously I'm not on that level, but I also get harassed for these very things. I also get exposed to horrible people purely because I'm talking about male victims of abuse. So that is what we need to get over. That is the barrier between us and helping these men. And it's slowly coming down. I think again, we talked a little bit more about how it's becoming more normal to talk about these things through the amazing brave work of people like Danny Dyer and the production team, and some of the people in that documentary I do know personally and are also them, like Martin Seeger. Uh, Through their work and the brave work of the man from that Channel 5 documentary, we are making these men visible in the same way that women were made visible in the 70s. Because this is not new. Like domestic violence in the late 60s and early 70s, until that point, we didn't want to hear about it. We just didn't believe it was the thing. It was behind closed doors. It was a private family matter, not a criminal thing at all. And it was Erin Pitsey who brought it out behind closed doors and set
Mhm.
up a refuge. So I think we're probably going to go through a similar explosion of awareness and support, but for male victims of abuse. And it's through these conversations and the work of Danny Dyer that we're going to make it a lot more visible and turn on the spotlight and actually hopefully start the movement to actually help men and see them as deserving of help and give them support and shelter.
One of the aspects, going back to Dan Dyer documentary, and I want to talk about this in more detail, was to do with child maintenance
Mm,
and men's reproductive rights.
mm,
And I would recommend, even if that story of the man who was struggling to see his son,
mm,
and the son ended up basically being murdered by the mother, even though the mother wasn't giving him visitation rights by
mm.
law. I mean, I've heard stories like that, but I still, my jaw always drops to the ground. And I just think how have we got to this point where we've got a system like that where men who are good men, who are good fathers, are not allowed to see their children because of
Mm.
basically to alienation. Like, what can we do to turn it around, in your view?
I think more visibility. So what the problem is that the UK family court system just seems intent on this idea that the mother is always what's best for the child. And it's never the father, it's always the mother by default, and that's how it works. And the story you're talking about is just brutal. And one of the, like, again, one of the most heartbreaking stories you could ever hear. A man in an abusive relationship with his wife, with a child involved, they get divorced. He obviously tries to get the child out of that abusive house, but can't because she's accusing him of abuse and accusing him of being a drug addict. And because of this corrupt family court system, they just obviously believe her without any evidence and
Mm,
ignore the evidence that he's actually got of being abused. And they leave the child of her for years, and she just denies any help, any sort of visitation whatsoever. Really drags out the criminal process, and eventually the family court system are like, "Oh, we have made a mistake here. Perhaps you've given custody to the wrong parent." And like, I think it was like maybe a week before the father finally got custody of the child, she murdered him.
yeah.
And again, it's Danny's face when he saw that, like, really paints a picture. And although that's an extreme situation, the the mindset it's based on is very common. That's just the default, and it's sexist. It's almost misogynistic to think that women are always perfect, saintly, motherly figures, and they can do no wrong, whilst the men are the violent criminal villains, abusers in waiting, potentially alcoholics. And that is a very antiquated worldview that belongs back in the 1960s, where the fact is fathers are just as important to children as mothers and just as capable of being a parent as mothers, and doesn't mean they're bad. And we need to, in a family court situation, give the mother and father an equal standing. We need to see them as equal parents. And then on from that 50-50 basis, they can build their own personal arguments. But that the death of that child is in not just the blood is not just on the hands of the mother, the blood is on the hands of the family court system and the antiquated beliefs and the people that protect it. A lot of them very high profile feminist lawyers such as Charlotte Proudman,
Yeah.
who talks endlessly, beating the drum about smashing the patriarchy and destroying stereotypes. And yet she's propping up the stereotype that caused the death of that child. And she's there, she's like, you're just a hypocrite, Charlotte, because you're not actually confronting the stereotypes. You're only confronting the stereotypes that harm women, which is quite right. But the stereotypes that harm men and benefit women at the cost of the lives of children, you're not interested in. In fact, you're not only not interested, but you're protecting them from being sort of exposed. So it's about time we pointed the finger at our so-called guardians of morality who have badged themselves as the sort of the gender equality advocates. And we're like, actually, you are part of the problem, a different type of problem. And it's about time they had a bit of limelight shone on them as well. So we do this idea, this antiquated idea that the mother is always right for the child is harming children and devastating fathers and just leaving families vulnerable to being torn apart.
Another side of that was talks about child maintenance payments. And I've never understood this with child maintenance in that why, and he's normally a father, why can't a father pay directly for their child? So, for instance, say if their child needed a new school uniform, why
Mm.
can't they go to the child and pay for it themselves and then produce receipts? Why does he have to go to their partner and then they can spend it and there's no checks and balances with regards to whether it's been spent on the children as well? And you've got
Yeah.
all these men being so much in debt, mainly
Mm.
because we know they have. I just think, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I did not I mean I didn't realize that was a thing, but that is awful. Like, yeah, there should be some sort of like a gift certificate where you can only spend it on, stationery or school uniform for the child. Like the idea that you can spend it on yourself, and I'm no doubt that happens all the time, is just like an obscene loophole that again is just not it just doesn't see women as capable of acting nefariously when obviously they can, just as nefariously as men, because they are just human beings after all. And obviously, if you give any parent the opportunity to spend child custody payments on themselves, some of them are going to do that. So, I mean, I'm totally in favor of some sort of system, some sort of coupon system where the father pays for coupons, and those coupons can only be spent on food for the child, clothing, stationery and that sort of stuff. And it's worse for like alimony because we don't really have that in this country. But in America, even if there is no child, the man, the former spouse, he has to pay her like alimony, even if there is no child. And that's crazy. Like 97% of alimony payers are men. And I was talking about this recently on my post where women have seen tremendous advances and success, hard-earned success that we should all be celebrating within the working system in America. 40% of breadwinners are now women. About 30% of businesses, private businesses, are owned by women. They own the majority of personal wealth in America. They're doing incredible things, and yet they're only 3% of alimony payers. So how could you be 40% of breadwinners and 3% of alimony payers? And again, it's like you want all the rights which you deserve, but you've got to accept responsibility too. You can't have rights without responsibility.
Mhm.
If you're going to be the breadwinner, you have to pay alimony or to scrap alimony altogether. But it's very one-sided. It's like you just want the good bits and none of the bad. And I don't know how long that's going to last. I feel like people are slowly waking up to that too.
Your last part there, is that one of the reasons why marriage rates have gone down, or the reluctance by men to get married? Because obviously marriage for society is very good,
Mm,
but I just wonder, saying what you were saying in regards to possible difference in violence, but more like in terms of, say, alimony, in terms
mm.
of child maintenance if it goes wrong.
Difficult
Is
because like
yeah,
to get married, obviously you're making yourself subject to alimony. But then if you don't get married, you don't have rights to your children. So like what like which one do you want?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
unmarried men in this country are so vulnerable to losing their right to the child and they're significantly disadvantaged. So by being married, you're not on equal footing, but you're in a much better position than an unmarried father. But then you're right, you're accepting a risk in a different way. Uh, I wouldn't want to comment on marriage rates because I don't really know why they're going down. Um, you'd have to compare it to like, you'd have to normalize for certain things like children, alimony payments, and employment styles. But it's certainly an interesting thing, and it wouldn't surprise me if that wasn't at least part of the problem. But there's probably lots of things going on. I think generally marriage is seen as sort of an antiquated religious sort of thing where people becoming less religious now are just seeing less need for marriage and or seeing the value of things that are similar to marriage that aren't quite the same.
Another study I heard you talk about was regards to hiring practices.
Hmm.
Um, can you just explain what that study was and what it looked at and the reasons why it produced the results it did, or the reasons given?
Oh, so yeah, it was the biggest study ever done on hiring bias. So basically, they looked at the CVs of similarly qualified men and women. They removed the gender, and then they monitored callback rates. So how are equally qualified men and women treated around the world uh, when it comes to being hired? And like, amazingly, they found that actually the discrimination that women face has now disappeared, and the discrimination that men face in women's fields, like teaching, for example, it exists. And in fact, often the discrimination women experience is now reversed in some cases. It's actually gone the other way, swung the pendulum so far that it's actually gone past the midpoint. Um, and again, we need to actually look at the system with fresh eyes, with a modern perspective, not just live in the 1970s and 80s as if nothing has changed, and actually be like, it is possible and it is right that men are being discriminated against when it comes to hiring in female-dominated industries. And it's time that those industries and those practices were subject to the exact same scrutiny and corrective action as was rightly um, projected onto the men's system. The whole old boys club has been destroyed, and now it's about time the old girls club was scrutinized a little bit more. Like, I know, like I just think we don't talk about that. We talk about women that are trying to get into the financial sector or engineering and like construction, for example, and how difficult it is. But no one ever talks about how difficult it's for a man to become a teacher or a psychologist, um, or even to like go to pick up their child from school and that the cliquiness of women who are just not letting. Like my brother-in-law is a dad, and he
Yeah,
often goes to pick up his kid, and he is just left on his own. He's not brought in. He's just shunned. And I'm like, that time that old girls club is, crowbarred open a little bit.
yeah. Why do you think? I mean, kind of giving reasons there, but why do you think that study produced the results it did? Is it because of how we are teaching boys in school? Is it because they're in terms of different jobs, like produce different outcomes? Like, what's
I just
your overall feeling on it?
I just think we're way more aware and willing to confront, and understandably so, the prejudices against women often held in male-dominated fields of work. So like everyone talks about getting women to STEM, and there's a lot to be said about that. But I feel like most people are strongly in favor of getting more women into these fields. And that is not a controversial opinion. That is the status quo now. And understandable that it is. But again, any discussion of the opposite is just not accepted. It's seen as obscene, it's laughed at. And but it exists. It exists and it's proven in like I said, the biggest study of its kind. Um, and we just need to update our view of sexism. Like I said, it's not the 1980s anymore. Things have changed. We've done incredible things, but it's
Mhm.
actually a good thing in many ways that how much success we've had. Same in education. Like women and girls are behind education in the 1970s, and now they're not. By 1980s, they were the same, and we kept on going. And now boys and men are further behind than women and girls were in 1970s, and we do nothing because we are unable to update our worldview. We're living in the past in many ways, and we're just not willing to give ourselves any sort of credit or women credit for the huge advances they have fought for. And I'm like, can we not just give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back and be like, well done, women. You're great now. We're going to go and help the boys in school for a little bit. But we don't. We just don't want to do that. And the same for hiring bias. I think that's the same phenomenon.
Yeah, indeed. I think the last time I interviewed you, I asked you what the left and the right get right about men's issues. So I'm kind of going to ask you the opposite now. What did they get wrong about men's issues?
The right seem to think masculinity is the solution. Left seem to think it's the problem. The right seem to think that our sex is completely biological and like our behaviors and interests as men and women are totally in our DNA and they can't be changed. And the left seem to think that gender is a complete social construct and there's no roots in biology. Uh, and it's just both are wrong. Both are wrong. Both are right and wrong. But we need to like be like, masculinity is neither the solution nor the problem. It just is. And sorry, what did I say? What did I say? But and my point is that being in the center is where we need to be. And gender, like I said, is neither a social construct nor entirely biologically produced. It's both. And people don't want to talk about both. People want to be like people want to be one side or the other. And people are very much entrenched in their ideological beliefs, and more so than ever. And like if you're not with us, you have them. And any divergence away from these set of political ideological beliefs, you're part of the problem, and there is no room for nuance anymore. And we just could become enamored of this very tribal um sort of sports team like worldview, I think.
Obviously, I was going to ask you because, as you say, we've become more divided over the last decade. So, how do we try and meet each other in the middle when it comes to issues like this? Because there's not just on left and right, there's just good
Mm.
points on all sides, but how do we come together in the middle and make sure that it's not ego driven, that we do it for the best intentions of men and not because we just want to satisfy our own egos?
Oh, yeah. I
I
think
mean,
yeah,
that's easier said than
you are
done.
right. Yeah, no, you're right. To go take our egos out of the equation a little bit and open ourselves up to the idea that maybe we're not quite right about every single thing in the world at all times. And there's just because someone holds a different opinion to you, politically speaking, doesn't mean they're the enemy. It just means they have a different point of view. I remember when I was on dating apps, for example, you'd often come across profiles that were like, if you're a Tory, I do not want you, you're a scumbag, I do not want to go on a date with you. Or if you're right wing, or if you're pro-life. And I'm like, was a Labour Party member, I'm on the left and I'm pro-choice. But I think I would still go on a date with someone that was a Tory. Uh, and again, like we're very much siloed off into our own little bubbles that are sort of self-perpetuating and only would sort of make the problem worse. And I don't know, it's just so interesting. I have like obviously in the context of Gaza and Israel, I have friends that are very pro-Israel and also very pro-Palestine. and I can talk to both of them. And although I disagree with what a lot of them say on both sides, that doesn't mean they're not my friend anymore. It doesn't mean I'm like, piss off, block and delete number. And like, they're still good people. And like, you can be a good person whilst holding political beliefs that are different to someone else's. Obviously, that doesn't count if it's a very extreme point of view, like if someone's just a racist.
Yeah,
But in
yeah.
generally speaking, like it doesn't mean you a bad person if you have a slightly different political opinion to me. In fact, it's the sort of person that you should want to hang out with because it keeps you in check. And like we need to be bringing more people into our friendship groups. Like I've been ostracized from so many friendship groups now as a result of having the beliefs I do. And I don't think I've necessarily changed. I think the world sort of changed and become hypersensitive to any sort of divergence from a very selective set of political opinions. And that is the problem. Like, like just not wanting to talk to, associate with, date, hang out with anyone that's different to yourself. And you're only building the walls of your own ignorance. And that's got to stop.
You talked about being ostracized there, and you said earlier about your followers, only about 20 of them will retweet or repost what you say.
20%.
Yeah, 20%. So have they given reasons as 80% given you reasons to
Yeah,
say why is this the
scared.
case?
They're
They're
scared.
scared. Yeah.
Understandably, I'm scared. Like I didn't even follow my own account. I've not shared one single post of mine on my personal Instagram account. I don't talk about it in public. I still find it quite uncomfortable in real life. I've certainly lost lots of friends, and it's not an unreasonable fear to have, I don't think, and it's one I share. And yeah, like 20%, only 20% of my following are comfortable sharing my content. I think I have poured more recently, and that has gone up slightly, so that does show a bit of progress.
Hmm.
But I also asked them why, and it was all the very fair reasons. Like I would lose my job, I would get into trouble. My partner wouldn't like it. It's not I'm unemployed. I'm trying to get work, and if someone checks out my social media, da, 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 what a lot of people at university, which are very much entrenched in these very fixed ideological beliefs, and they're like, it's not worth the pain, suffering, and risk. And like people unfollow me all the time, or people just block me, or I'll get angry messages sent to me calling me a misogynist, or I'll get called an incel. And like again, people have got their fingers in their ears and they don't want to hear what you've got to say, despite what you're saying being fair and evidence-based and fundamentally compassionate and the right thing to do. So yeah, maybe 1 in 5 of my followers is comfortable sharing my content. I'm not part of that group. I don't share it, and the reasons they give are fair, I think, fair. And those people that say that to me, I'm like, please do not share any of my content that you're not comfortable with. Like, it's not worth it. I don't want you to. I'm not asking you to. Do not do anything you're not comfortable doing, please.
Is there, and I don't mean it as a reflection on you or others, but when you have issues like this that struggle to, like, a lot of people are thinking but they're afraid of saying in a public eye, is it going to take quite a few number of individuals to stand up and risk it all
Yeah.
before you say,
Yeah.
okay, then, you know what, I actually agree with you on this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Some more people have got to put their head above the parapet.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
more lives have to be sacrificed on the altar of social media advocacy, unfortunately. Like I can't just be me. Like I do get shit on every single day by people that just don't like me. And that has to happen more. And we have to be unafraid of being called these stupid names like a bigot or misogynist. And like that is just gonna happen. And it's fine if it happens. Doesn't make it true. Like, John McWhorter said that in terms of confronting a lot of like a lot of the rhetoric in America, and he's like, you just can't be afraid of being called a racist to the point where you're going to allow these people to manipulate the conversation and lead people down the wrong path. And like I would say the same. You can't be afraid of being called a misogynist or an incel or a virgin or whatever else you might and will get called. Doesn't make it true. It just means the person you're talking to is immature little brat in my experience. And I sleep well at night knowing that I'm living true to my beliefs. And whether or not someone likes that isn't of no interest to me. I know what I'm saying is fair. I know it's important. I know the support I get is overwhelmingly larger than the negative response. And it's all evidence based. It's all factual. Like ultimately, all I'm doing is holding up a mirror. And if people don't like what is reflected in that mirror, that is just not my problem. And there's no apology to be made for that. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going to have to be sacrificed on the like I said, on the altar of social justice, if we are actually going to have change. But I would say it's not as bad as people think. Like I do, and obviously I painted quite a dour image there, but I get overwhelming support. I got a message from a 90-year-old woman just yesterday saying that she shares all my content with all her grandchildren. And I was just like, that has got, if I could give you an award, I would give it to you. That is amazing. Thank you for being like grandma of the year. And more people should do that. And it will happen. Like the first one through are always the ones that get bloodied the most.
Mhm.
And I'm one of those, unfortunately. And we need many more behind me and people such as yourself. And just to prove like we're not misogynistic incels. We're just normal people making fair points. And people will see that. People will see that people like us are actually not the problem. And the people that are yelling from the trenches and calling us these stupid names, they are the problem, just a different type of problem. And I think that will naturally solve itself over time as it already is.
Well, what I'll say is a little bit of stay away from this conversation we're having is if people are listening, think about it in regards to perception and character. So if you know what you're doing is good
Mm,
and you know it from your heart, then that's more important than the
mm,
perception you're going to get. Obviously, a little bit of perception is important because you want to spread your message and whatnot. But I would say if you like your work, you know what you're doing is good. I've spoken to you twice and it's clear that you're a good man. So I know you're doing
well,
good
thank
work.
you.
So I'd say to people, just think about that. Your character is such that it's good, and you know you're doing is good. And once your character is strong, then people's perception of you is just water off a duck's back because you'll know what you're doing is right.
And yeah, and with that, I would encourage people that are confronted with these trolls, like don't fall to their level. Don't become the person they want you to be. Like if someone's trying to antagonize you by calling you an incel, don't respond by calling them a femcel. Take the high road. Like Michelle Obama said, when they go low, you go high, and set a better example. Because I promise you, there are a huge amount of people watching that conversation take place, either online or in real life that are quietly making up their mind on whose side they want to be on. And if you just yell back in their face, you're just basically a recruiting sergeant for the person opposite you, and you're just going to give them more and more support. So try, and as difficult it is, and I don't always get it right, I often get it wrong. Uh, don't respond to anger with more anger. Try and respond with kindness and compassion and diplomacy. As hard as it is, like it's bloody hard. Like it's and
Yeah, it's a
sometimes
skill. It's a skill in itself.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like take a moment and don't just remember it's not just you two in a conversation. There's probably about 20 people all watching what's happening. And you may not change that person's mind in front of you, but you certainly can change the minds of the silent readers that are watching.
Yeah. And I would also add is why waste your time and energy on people who their regardless of what you're doing, but their basic thought process is, like I said, very basic.
Mm,
There's no in-depth conversation. I'll talk
mm,
to anyone who will I disagree with or agree
mm,
with. As long as I have that dialogue, I'm fine with that. But I
mm,
think a lot of people respond to others who, like I say, with the trolls, where their basic premise is so basic, oh, you're misogynist, you're a bigot, and so on and so forth. Why engage with them?
mm.
Because at the end of the day, it's they're not offering you anything intellectually. So why engage with someone like that? And that's what I say to people. If your character's strong, then what people perceive of you doesn't matter because you know what you're doing is from the goodness of your heart. And also, if you don't waste your energy on people whose intellectual capacity is very low and the only thing they can come up with is misogynist and bigot. It's true though,
That's a
like
kind way of putting it. Yeah.
why waste time and
No,
energy?
yeah, no, I'm totally agree. And like, remember, like, truth isn't measured in mass appeal.
Yeah.
Like, just because they may have a bigger following, or maybe they do get more support, doesn't mean they're right. Doesn't mean they're right at all. And like, personally, I wouldn't want to be successful for things that I don't find authentic to myself. I'd rather be an absolutely catastrophic failure, but as long as fail for the things I believe in, I don't mind that. I don't mind going through my life and failing as long as I stood for the things I believe in. Rather that than have huge amount of success, but be a fundamentally disingenuous person.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like I said, if character's true, you've got a high heart, that strengthens you,
Mm,
especially in particular.
mm,
One other thing I want to talk to you about quickly is this has been whole talk about this minister for men. Do you
Mm.
think we're any closer to getting that minister for men at all?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, got a campaign right here for my Minister for Men. Here's my Minister for Men campaign. I'll
Okay.
have to release it later. But I remember when I first started talking about Minister for Men in maybe 2019, and people would laugh at me. People would roll their eyes and scoff and shout and worse. And they thought it was a ridiculous, misogynistic concept. And now it's no longer being discussed by people like me online. It's being discussed on mainstream news. It's being discussed in Parliament. It's the subject of petitions, and the petitions have failed. I think one of them actually expired today, and it has failed. But it got more votes than it did last time, and that got more votes than it did the time before that. And again, we're making progress. We're not got there yet, but I think we will see a minister for men in the next 5 years, and it's about time. And it's all part of the process, all part of the journey. The Minister for Men is just one of the products of that journey, and the journey is going in the right direction. Whether it will be next year or the year after that or 5 years from now, I do not know, but I do know we're going in the right direction, and I do know these conversations are being. Oh, people are more receptive to the idea of a Minister for Men. I know, I know there was a poll, only a Twitter poll, I think it's by Good Morning Britain, and they were like, "Do you support Minister for Men?" And it's like 50-50. And I'm like, that's progress. Like we're almost in the majority of support. And I reckon 5 years time, 5 years ago, it would have been like 10%. Like I said, when I was talking about it, I was just laughed out of town. But it's not so funny now. And it's like, it's
Mhm.
actually not even that controversial an idea. And it shouldn't be a controversial idea. So yeah, I've got a campaign for Minister for Men. I'll have to release it later, but it's very exciting. And it's going to be the next attempt, another petition. We need to get that 10,000 signatures. And we will see what happens next.
Do you think one of the reasons it's deemed controversial is because the perception is that if we talk about men's issues, you sound kind of downgrading women's issues, and that there'll be a like a collision, when in reality there's separate things that both
Mm.
men and women have issues with and we need to solve. I'm correct.
Uh, I think that's part of it, for sure. I don't think that's obviously not true. Like we can have two conversations at the same time.
Mhm.
And not only does talking about men not detract from women's issues, but I would say it helps women too. Like women indirectly benefit from all the things we talk about, like like domestic violence, for example, because it's cyclical. If we are able to help male victims of violence, we will also be helping female victims of violence. Um, it's down to a lot of things, but I think the fact is that people see Minister for Men as adjacent to the idea of like a minister for white people, which is an obscene thing to do. Like, I do
Mhm.
not, I don't want a minister for white people. I don't want a minister for straight people. I don't want a minister for able-bodied people. But I do want a minister for men because being a man is not the same as being white. Obviously, I am white and I am straight, and those are both massive leg ups in my life. And I'm happy to admit that more or less being white is just helps me out every single day of my life. So does being straight. But being a man is a mixed bag. Being a man is like a many-feathered bird. Some advantages, some disadvantages. So the idea of uh, advocating for men being the same as advocating for white people or straight people or able-bodied people is obscene and just a complete false equivalence. So that's another hurdle we need to get over. The hurdle of talking about men doesn't hurt talking about women, and also talking about men is not the same as talking about white people. I think those are probably the two big roadblocks, and we're slowly getting over them for the same reason as I said earlier, where just talking about it, awareness raising, and also like going back to the whole like idea of being white and being male as being the same thing, and supposedly being a woman is the same as being black, which is an obscene thing to say. Talking about men also helps black people because the intersectional nature of men's issues intersects heavily with black communities. Like
Mhm.
black boys, black men are often paying a double penalty of many of the things I talk about, such as incarceration, such as police brutality, such as education. Like black men are behind black women in more or less every single metric in America right now. Everything, health outcomes, education, suicide, drug addiction, homelessness, you name it, they're behind. So to talk about men is to also indirectly talk about black people. So I just feel like you're looking at a much higher definition image of those different problems, especially like police brutality, if you can also look at it as a gendered issue as well as a racial one.
Have any of the political, I know you talked earlier about the Labour Party talking about detoxifying young men from the influence of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
But have any of the major political parties talked about what they may include in like their manifestos for this year's election regarding men's
I'm
issues?
really, I'm really excited to find out. I can't wait. I mean, here's here's the London Mayor's manifesto. It's currently in the bin, and I'm looking forward to many more manifestos joining it. Um, I've not got much hope for the Labour Party. As it stands, I'm not going to be voting for them. I voted for them every single election, apart from one time when I voted Greens, and I won't be voting for them this year because I just don't believe in them. Neither will I be voting for the Tories, obviously not. But at the same time, I feel like the Conservatives are doing a better job. Like somehow they're doing a better job. Like you look like Nick Fletcher, who is the chairman of the APPG on men and boys issues, which is a new all-party parliamentary group set up to talk about the very things I talk about, but from a parliamentary point of view, which is excellent. And again, I got lots of friends on that group that are just amazing. He is he is more of a figurehead, but he is a conservative. And again, I feel like the conservatives are just better positioned, ideologically speaking, to talk about men and boys. And it's disappointing because I will never vote for them. So I don't know who I'm going to vote for. Probably nobody. But I'm looking forward to seeing the manifesto. And I would love it if the Conservatives would lead the way and talk about men and boys, such as like boys' education would be a great thing to start with. And
Mhm.
I feel like they would get a huge amount of support. I feel like there are so many disaffected men and boys that are sick of it, sick of this left-wing whining, and they can be scooped up by any politician, left or right, brave enough to speak to them. Like all those boys who are following Andrew Tate, that is just like a finger in the air sort of test of how many disaffected boys and men there are. And there are huge, there's probably two in the school right now that are just completely lost, politically speaking, politically homeless. And I would love to see a manifesto talks about men and boys and women and girls. And I would love to see them receive the appropriate amount of support for being so brave to do that very thing.
Yeah, indeed. George, as ever, it's been a pleasure talking to you. If people want to look at your work, where can I go?
You can find me on Instagram, TheTinMen, although we have expanded into Twitter and LinkedIn. Discord still going very well, but Instagram is still the meat and gravy of my work. That's where I'm posting more or less every single day, and that is TheTinMen on Instagram.
Okay, cool. I'll leave those links in the description
Thank
to
you.
this video. Pleasure as always, and thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
No problem, Chris. I'm happy to be here.